Jesus is the hero of the Bible. And Jesus, if you allow him to, can be the hero of your life. He's certainly the hero of mine. Welcome to this third session of Fully Alive. It's in this session that we get the privilege of learning from the most fully alive person to ever walk the planet, Jesus, the master of the art of living. He's our model, and he's the one we get to follow. The Bible says that Jesus was born fully alive. He, like Adam and Eve, was born lacking nothing. The thief used the same temptation strategy with Jesus that he did with Adam and Eve, but it did not work. It's a big difference between the first Adam and what the Bible calls the second Adam, or the second man, Jesus. And that story of that temptation effort that the thief tried to put on Jesus himself was so important that it was recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels, or the 3 of the 4 books that share Jesus' life in the Bible. Jesus began his ministry with a 40-day fast in the desert, and Satan used that vulnerable time to come hard at Jesus and offer him shortcuts fitting for God's Son. You can read it. Satan failed. Jesus resisted those temptations at every turn. And I find it ironic that Satan could turn Adam and Eve in a garden full of everything, but he failed to turn a starving Jesus in the middle of the parched desert. Jesus is our hero, and our hero was on a mission. He came to bring fully alive back to you, and nothing at all would deter him. Let's talk about Jesus' fully alive life. Let's start with intimacy. Jesus' intimacy was demonstrated in his consistent service to people. He was filled with compassion for the broken. He tirelessly taught and healed masses of people. He was patient with his disciples, and he never succumbed to the sensuality cistern. Jesus was fully alive with intimacy. Jesus' influence was demonstrated on many occasions as well. He calmed a raging storm with just his words. He fed 5,000 people with one boy's lunch. He raised Lazarus from the dead. He turned water into wine. He drove evil spirits out of people. He walked on water. He helped fishermen catch record numbers of fish. And he never used that coercion to build his own fame and reputation. He always refused that opportunity. But he did use his influence to serve. Jesus was fully alive with influence. But I believe that Jesus' ultimate demonstration of his intimacy and influence was one that still blows my mind every time I think about it, and it happened while he was dying on the cross. In this most vulnerable of moments, he was naked, he was exposed, he'd been tortured. Jesus' primary concern at that moment was not his pain or the injustice of the situation. His focus was to show love to those that were killing him. One of his last spoken phrases before he died was, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Now that is pure, untarnished, selfless intimacy at its absolute finest. And it's the model, an ideal type of intimacy that we can imitate in our relationships with one another. But selfless intimacy wasn't all Jesus demonstrated on that cross. He also demonstrated selfless influence. One of the onlookers watching Jesus suffer actually chided him while he was on the cross, saying, "If you're the Son of God, save yourself and come down from the cross." Well, in spite of that chiding, Jesus, the man who leveraged his infinite influence to save many, refused to use that influence to save himself. He voluntarily allowed them to kill him, knowing that his real influence would come through that sacrifice. Jesus' death and the upcoming resurrection would be the knockout punch for the thief and his strategy. Jesus' death and resurrection would reverse the spiritual death that came through Adam and Eve. If you remember, God said, "You'll surely die." They didn't physically die, they spiritually died. Well, Jesus' physical resurrection becomes the opportunity for our spiritual resurrection, paving the way for us to live fully alive again. Now that kind of long-term game, that's what real influence looks like. And that's why Jesus is our hero. In spite of the circumstances, Jesus always chose God's fully alive way. He saw the systems of sex and power for what they were, cheap substitutes for the real thing, and he rejected them at every turn. Now, I know this is an awful lot to take in, but I want you to consider taking this one step further. I want desperately for you to see how intimately personal this promise from Jesus is for you. Jesus chose God's best, even when it cost him his life, for you. For you. He wanted you. He knows the cisterns that trip you up, and he can't bear to see you settle for them. Jesus came to show you, not simply tell you, that he loves you. Why else would he endure so much? Why else would he so unconditionally love you and those that were around him in his day? He came to answer your deepest longings in the most complete and soul-settling way. Hear this. You are lovable because you are loved by Jesus. You are valuable because Jesus values you enough to put your life ahead of his own. I'll say that one more time. You're lovable because you're loved by Jesus. You're valuable because Jesus values you enough to put your life ahead of his own. That's the gospel. That's the good news that Jesus brought from heaven. Jesus came for you to live fully alive. And please don't be tempted to think that this is an easy thing for Jesus to do. Don't be tempted to dismiss this as simply saying, well, I already knew that. Many people know it, but few have actually felt it deep within their spiritual guts. This thought of Jesus facing the cross tortured him. He begged his Father to find another way 3 different times before it all went down. Here's the story. I'll read just a portion of this story so you can feel the agony that Jesus felt. Jesus told his disciples, my soul is crushed with grief. Do you hear that? My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. He went on a little further and bowed his face to the ground, praying. This is all in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying, my Father, if it is possible, listen to this, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet, I want your will to be done, not mine. And then Jesus prayed a second time, my Father, if this cup cannot be taken away unless I drink it, your will be done. That was the second time he asked for it. Then he went to pray a third time, saying the same things again. Father, if there's any other way, let's do that way. Luke's account of this is even more vivid. It says he prayed more fervently, and he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell to the ground like great drops of blood. And every time I read this passage, I think, how did he do it? How did he go forward with it? His disciples kept falling asleep. If you read the whole story, they kept falling asleep every time he went back. He could have left. He could have escaped. But I believe he stayed because he saw your face. He saw your inability to escape the lure of the toxic cisterns, and he couldn't stand the thought of you not having a shot to live fully alive. So as tortured as he was by the idea, he stood up and he did it. And he did it for you. And the beautiful thing is that death is never the end for those who are fully alive. Jesus was raised physically from the dead, and Jesus' resurrection was far more than one man's victory over the grave. Jesus, through his death and resurrection, blazed a path from death to life for you, for us. Listen to these powerful words from 1 Corinthians 15. It says there, Christ has been raised from the dead. He is the first of a great harvest of all who have died. And just as everyone dies because we all belong to Adam, here's Paul in Corinthians actually commenting back on the passages that we've already looked at. Just as everyone dies because we all belong to Adam, everyone who belongs to Christ, this second Adam, will be given new life. So how do we move from death to life? That's what we're going to cover in session 4. Until then, let's keep up the habit of reading and responding to these key verses that we've looked at. Read the verse, asking this risen Jesus to speak to you personally through them. Write down what he shares with you. Write down what he's asking you to do through what he taught you. Write down who you're going to share with this, and then I'll see you here in session 4.